working. Okay, well, at least everyone in blue jeans can hear me do the important bit, and that's to introduce our speaker today. So our speaker is Elizabeth Simmons. She's currently the Executive Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs and a distinguished professor at the University of California, San Diego. So Elizabeth received her PhD in 1990 from the University of Harvard under the supervision of Howard Georgi. Up until 2003, she was a professor at Boston University. And then she moved to the University to Michigan State University as a professor of physics, and also as the director of the Lyman Briggs College, and she subsequently became dean of that college. In 2013, she became a distinguished professor at Michigan State University, and then in 2017, she moved to her current role at the University of San Diego. Elizabeth is a fellow of the AAAS and the APS, and has received numerous awards. For example, the Robert F. Banks Award for Institutional Leadership. So Elizabeth is also a counsellor on the APS, and she's actually the representative for the GHP, to that council. And of course, many of us in this room have served on the GHP executive, so we thank her for her representation. Now, Elizabeth is dedicated to diversity in the physical sciences. And today she's going to talk to us about gender, equity, power structures, and implicit bias in STEM. So thank you, Elizabeth. We look forward to your talk.
Thanks very much. It's a real pleasure to be here. So it's always good to get a chance to come back to Argonne. I've enjoyed my visits here very much over the years to various conferences and so on. And I'm glad to have the chance for a conversation about one of the topics that's of particular importance to me. And in starting off these sorts of conversations, I like to start by reminding us, why are we here? Well, I can start with, why am I here? Why am I here to talk with you about this? And one thing that you should know, we all come with our backstories, right? And you've heard about my titles and so on, and how I'm the what would normally be called except University of California has different names for everything. So I'm what would normally be called the provost of the university. Different honors I've had and so on. But you won't know that my backstory, like that of pretty much all the women physicists that I know, is I've had a lot of sort of interesting experiences, you could say, because of being a woman. I've experienced sexual harassment, stalking, bullying, all through the early parts of my career. Whenever, back in the days before you would, we would all have little screens with us and bury ourselves in our screens on airplanes. It used to be you'd sit down next to someone for a 6-hour flight, and the two of you would say, oh, nice to meet you, what do you do? And whenever I would tell someone I was a physicist, they were always incredulous. You don't look like a physicist. And I could only conclude it was because I was a woman, because the stereotypes are that physicists are white men, and okay, I'm white, but I'm not a guy, and so I think that that had to be the basis for all of this. So thinking about all these things made me very conscious of the need to discuss and work on equity in STEM so that we could change the nature of the field so that as more people from different backgrounds are entering the field, more people will feel actually comfortable to stay and work on the science and flourish. And so that's why I'm here and why I like to have these conversations. Now, we should ask, where exactly are we? And so I'm going to go through a few statistics by way of background to make sure that we all have the same information in mind. And these are the latest statistics. The American Institute of Physics thoughtfully just updated all of its statistics this spring, so I can share with you the latest and greatest. So we'll start just by looking at things broken out by gender. And this is binary gender is what the statistics show, because the statistics ultimately are collected by government agencies, and they just look at things as men and women, and that's as far as the feds pretty much know. So starting out, if you look at degrees earned in physics, and this shows the percentage of degrees earned in physics by year, going from 1977 to 2017. So percentage, you can see bachelor's degrees in blue, PhDs in yellow. And what you see is first a history of increase, and then really plateauing in the last 5-10 years, around 20% of degrees in physics being earned by women. And if you wonder what underpins the plateauing, what happened is you can see that there's been this is bachelor's degrees, a slow, steady rise in the number of women earning bachelor's degrees up to not quite 2,000 in the most recent year. But at the same time, the total really growing much more rapidly. And similarly for PhDs, only topping out for women about 400 earned in the most recent year where there's the data. So that's people earning degrees. And then you say, well, how are we doing relative to other fields? And we're pathetic. We really are. We are in green at the very bottom down here. That's physics. We used to be able to point to the engineers and kind of laugh at the engineers a little, but the tables have turned. They can laugh at us. Computer science used to do better than us. We're right here with computer science, not doing too well. And we're all three really bad, right? We have nothing to brag about. And meanwhile, you look at, okay, astronomy is separated off here. Astronomy is doing better. Chemistry is doing better. Mathematics is doing better than we are. And of course, the life sciences are in a completely different universe, really. So, look, there are more than 50% of the PhDs being earned by women, and have been for some time. And so you say, wow, we're doing something differently, and apparently our different is not really good. So that's where we are as far as who's earning degrees. Now, if you look at the situation of, and the statistics tend to be for, the AIP statistics tend to be for faculty rather than for national labs. But I think there are a lot of cultural things that are similar, so I don't think it's bad to talk a little bit about that. And you can see that while the, say, assistant professor numbers are kind of consistent with the PhDs coming out, they're at about 23%. The associate professors not far behind. Not surprising, because you do have to be evaluated to go to permanent employment status. You can't just stick around at associate professor. But the full professor numbers have really languished. And that's because, you don't have to ever get that promotion, right? The most recent woman to win a Nobel Prize in physics was still an associate professor at the time that she won the Nobel Prize, right? So there's a lag, still only 10% of the full professors. And I think that carries over to senior staff scientists, senior research scientists are women. And if you look at it broken out a slightly different way, this is looking at physics departments. The median size is about 30. And this is showing the percentage of departments that have, and these are just PhD granting departments, the percentage that have no women, 1 woman, 2 women, and so on. And you can see that things have changed between 2002 in blue, 2014 in gold, but about half nowadays still of the women are in a department where fewer than 10% are women, and where they're likely to be the only woman in the department. Or maybe there's 1 other woman. And even if there are 2 other women, still, if you think of the size of typical working groups or working committees that you're in a department, you have to decide about space allocation or who's going to organize the conference or whatever the thing is. Usually those committees are relatively small, so you're probably going to be the only woman in the room a lot of the time. And that certainly was my experience when I was spending most of my time working in a physics department as opposed to in an administrative role. I was really often the only woman in the room. And being the only, even when the other people in the room are really nice, it can come up. There's certain assumptions, cultural assumptions that people make, and which don't always translate for everybody in the room. So it can definitely impact experience, and qualitative data that the APS has gathered suggests it really does make a difference to people's experience. So that's just gender. Let's add in race as well, because that's very important to look at. And again, we might look at who's earning bachelor's degrees. So this is now, if you thought that the vertical axis was percent, you'd think, how could this even be possible? But it's number, it's head count. Number of women of particular racial or ethnic groups earning bachelor's degrees in physics. Now, for Hispanic American women, we've got a bit of a good trend going on with a sharp rise now in the most recent years. And so that's topping out at the moment about 100, so that's about 5% of those 2,000 women who are earning bachelor's degrees yearly. For African Americans, this is really embarrassing. Over this 20-year period, we've seen an actual, flat, if we want to really be charitable to ourselves, flat to declining, and the top number is only more at the sort of 2.5% level. And that's really disturbing. That's just painful, I think, to look at. If you want to look at the information on earning PhDs, the AIP won't even make a graph like this because the numbers are so small that it would begin to invade people's privacy, because you'd be able to say, oh, there was only one PhD. Oh, I know who she is. And that's creepy, right? So they won't even make the graph. All they'll say is that overall, for a number of PhDs, again, the percentages are similar, that it's about 5% of the 5% being earned by Hispanic women, and about sort of 3% African American women. When you look at faculty, they are willing to, I'm not sure, again, I'm not totally sure they should, but they're willing to make the graph. And here you can see PhD granting departments. These are physics departments where the highest degree offered is the master's degree. Here, the highest degree offered is the bachelor's, so liberal arts colleges and such. And here we have so different years, and the color coding breaks things out by race and ethnicity. And here, the orange color is for Hispanic Americans, and the green for African Americans. Now, if you go and add up for all the women, this is women faculty in physics departments that grant the PhD, it adds up to about 900. So you'd say, based on the demographics of the United States, you'd expect of order 100 of those to be African American women physicists. And it's 14. And even worse, if you look at the little green boxes, it's been stuck at 14. It hasn't even been going up. And the numbers for Hispanic Americans at least have been going up, but it's really troubling. And I think, I look at that and I thought to myself, oh, wait, no, I know it's 15 now because I know somebody who just got a job. And then I had to think, yeah, but maybe someone else retired. Maybe it is still 14 even into today. And it's just really disturbing. We have to do better than this. Now, if we move on to add factors related to gender identity and sexual orientation, well, the federal government doesn't even collect statistics on that. They don't recognize that as something important to consider. So the APS wanted to know, what is the climate like for people who identify as part of the LGBT community in physics? And they realized there was no data. So Kate Kirby, the executive officer, formed an ad hoc committee, which the names are listed here. I was fortunate enough to be part of that committee. One of a nuclear physics colleague of some of yours, Elena Long, was on it, and you can see quite a number of people from a variety of places. And so we did our own survey work. partly with the APS, partly some independent survey work to get more. APS helped us get some demographic information. We also did some more qualitative work as well to find out about people's experiences. And you can read the full report, but I'll just mention a couple of the highlights. And one of the things that we found was that what people experienced in their workplace, whether it was at a national lab or in industry or in academia, turned out to depend a lot on how they presented publicly in terms of gender identity. So the survey was answered only by people identifying as LGBT by design. And we asked questions about, for example, what is your workplace a comfortable workplace for you? And have you ever observed people being harassed on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity? And for both of these statistics, you can see that individuals who present as men, experienced some degree of either uncomfortable climate or observing harassment. Those who identify as women, the stats go up. And those who identify as gender nonconforming, which might be somebody presenting, say, as non-binary or androgynous, or there are a bunch of different terms that kind of get captured there, twice as high a rate of experiencing really bad climate as those presenting as men. So this intersection, as we saw, between race and gender was meaning that there were far fewer African American women faculty in physics than we would have naively expected. Here, we're seeing that the intersection between gender presentation and then sexual orientation and those kinds of factors also has a big impact on what you experience. Now, looking at the levels of people saying that there were problems in the work climate led to, it turned out that many of them were experiencing that there was overt pressure to be closeted, to not mention, for a woman not to mention that she had a girlfriend or a wife, and so on, just to never even go there in casual conversation with their colleagues, which is a pretty uncomfortable way to have to live when everybody else is talking about their plans for the weekend and what weddings they've been to and so on. And there was, we found a strong correlation between how the climate was, whether the climate was perceived as welcoming or not, and whether people were even willing to be out about their status as feeling part of the LGBT community. And all of this turned out to really impact how people felt about their careers. Just in the single year before the survey, that's how we phrased the question, more than a third of those who were answering the survey had considered just leaving their workplace or dropping out of their graduate program. These were people who were very talented, very accomplished, very highly trained already. They were senior graduate students, they were postdocs, they were faculty. And the field was in danger of losing that high a percentage of them because of how bad things were. And again, that was just really distressing to learn that that's what some of my own colleagues were evidently experiencing. And it's within the power of all of us to change that, to make our field different. So again, one could ask from a different point of view, if that's where we are, why are we here? How did we get there? What leads us to this place? Now, some of it has to do with US culture in general, or the culture that we grow up in general, that impacts all of us. And so I'll talk a bit about implicit bias and some different facets of it. So as I'm talking to you right now, there are different parts of my brain are helping me do that. There's the conscious part of my brain where I've designed the slides, I've figured out what I want to talk to you about, and that's sort of keeping things going at the higher intellectual level. But in terms of my being able to breathe and walk around and precisely pronounce the words, I'm not using my conscious brain for that. That's the sort of lizard brain at the, closer to the brain stem, right? That's doing a lot of those automatic things for me. So I do keep breathing because, yeah, you know how it is. If you actually had to think about it, you'd probably forget because you get busy, you get engaged in something. But in between, there's a part of essentially the software, if you will, that's described in this interesting book, Strangers to Ourselves, something called the adaptive unconscious. And that's the part that helps us, that provides pattern recognition, so that I don't have to think, is that a chair? Okay, that's a chair. Oh, but what about this one? Is that also a chair? And considering it from the beginning, no, I recognize the pattern of what is a chair and what is a person and so on. And that means it's possible for us to go about our days in a much more efficient way than if we had to identify every single object we encountered de novo. So the adaptive unconscious is really helpful for much of what we do in life. But the pattern recognition, in a sense, it doesn't know where to stop. And it links up things that logically shouldn't necessarily be linked. It means that because of what we grow up with in our culture, we begin to link things that are correlated, maybe for historical reasons, as though there's a causation involved. So, for example, we start to make assumptions about what sorts of jobs women ought to have, or how women ought to not only dress, but how they ought to speak, how they should modulate their voice, what range of emotion is it acceptable for them to express. And then when we meet women who have a job that doesn't match that, or who express themselves in ways that maybe are more assertive than the stereotype suggests, we're uncomfortable with that. But the same for guys, too, right? There are certain very rigid ideas about what jobs men should have, how much emotion they should express. And again, when we run into individuals who are counter to stereotype, we get uncomfortable, and we may react badly, and we may not want to interact as much with that person. So these patterns, and they go for race, they go for all sorts of different factors, and the thing is that we're not aware that our pattern recognition software in our brains is doing this, because it just happens at this level that we're not even conscious of, just as I'm not conscious of realizing that both of these things are chairs. So it turns out that the research shows that these sorts of implicit biases or unconscious biases, they're a product of the culture that you grow up in. So it turns out that, for example, if you think of ones related to men and women all have the same unconscious biases. If you think of the ones related to race, people of different races in America have the same implicit biases, against their own race, against a different race. And you can go online, just Google implicit associations test, and it'll take you to the Harvard website, and you can take the test, and you'll see what your implicit biases are. And I've done the test. It's not fun to come out the other side and realize, darn it, I thought I was really, not a biased person. And then you realize the back of my brain is like everyone else's. The question is, what do I choose to do consciously to not just react according to those implicit biases? So making that conscious decision to not let the implicit bias rule what we do is the reason that it's important to have training and to think very concretely, okay, as we run this search, how will we structure our work to make sure that we're using our conscious mind to do it well, instead of letting our gut reactions or our unconscious biases unwittingly make choices for us that we wouldn't have wanted to make in that way. Because it turns out that these biases, they impact us when we're on hiring committees, when we're selecting which graduate students to pick, when we're deciding who to put up for a prize, who gets how much space, who gets to go represent the collaboration at a conference. All these professional decisions we make, if we're not careful, will be impacted. Moreover, they don't only impact how we make decisions about others, but they can impact how we present ourselves and how we do in the world. As Claude Steele's work shows, he coined the phrase stereotype threat. And his book, Whistling Vivaldi, is really interesting, especially the story that leads to the title of the book. But the research shows that if there's a stereotype about the group that I belong to, if I am reminded about that stereotype just before I'm supposed to do a task that the stereotype would predict how well I would do on that task, my being reminded of the stereotype right before I do on the task will, in fact, impact it. So, for example, when girls are taking the math part of the SAT or the GRE, if they have to fill out their name and the demographic information before they take the math part of the test, then they do worse on the test than if they had done all that stuff at the end. Because being reminded that they're a woman, and that triggers the memory that, oh yes, somewhere in the unconscious part of the brain, it reminds them, oh yeah, girls aren't good at math, as the Barbie dolls used to tell us. And there is no impact for men on the math part of the SAT because the stereotype is, yeah, you shouldn't have a problem with math. So these things impact not only how we treat others, but how we treat ourselves. And that's why it's so important for us to know about them. There are, so one place this comes up is how we think about how our field works. And so there's some really interesting research published in Science about if you look at different fields according to the percentage of people earning PhDs in that field who are women. And then they did survey research to find out what were the attitudes of practitioners in the field regarding what it took to be good in the field. And it turned out that there is this really interesting correlation between the degree to which practitioners in a field think that to be good in my field, you have to have innate brilliance in my field, as opposed to be good in my field, you need to study hard and study several different disciplines and put it all together. Those are kind of different concepts. And in the arts and humanities, it turned out that there is a spectrum, and philosophy was way, way out there with, oh, you must be born with innate brilliance as a philosopher or you'll never make it. And guess what? Not many women in philosophy, not many earning PhDs. And in the sciences, we're kind of out there in the this belief that you must have an innate inborn brilliance in physics to succeed, and correlating with the really low percentage of PhDs who are women. But I want to ask you something about this. How many of you have ever taken a course in physics? How many of you have ever taught a course in physics? Why are we wasting our time? If we really believed that consciously, we wouldn't offer courses and degrees in physics, and we wouldn't pay lots of money to get those degrees, right? So consciously, we know that couldn't possibly be the case. We wouldn't build our careers on this. But at the level, the unconscious bias that's revealed by this sort of survey research says, this could be impacting what's going on. I saw somebody was raising their hand. Did you have a question? Yeah.
Do you know what the correlation parameter in that plot is?
I do not know. But you can go read the science article. I don't know I don't recall that. And you can find out the horizontal size of the error bars and so on.
I have a comment.
Yeah.
I think this is really related to self-fulfilled prophecy. You teach and you show that, in fact, if the results show that women are not doing that great or minorities, then your preconceived idea is happening.
Absolutely. It shows that these psychological factors and our cultural biases all come in if we're not careful to question them. And at the same time, as I say, this is at odds with all of these fields offer degrees. So rationally, this is not at all what we would say. But it's interesting to see, you've got the life sciences way up there. As we saw before, a lot more women, and just the way they talk about the field is different. There's another place that this shows up, which is, that's fascinating. Okay, I don't know what happened there, but, oh, wow, that's really interesting. There's some sort of,
Implicit bias?
Yeah, right. There's something Argonne doesn't want you to see the last bullet. Okay, well we can make sure that a PDF version guaranteed to show you all of the secrets is there. But the point is that if you go back and look at this slide, it talks about some solutions that can be employed. And I wasn't actually going to talk about the solution slides because you can look at that later, or we could get to that in the discussion. But what I wanted to go on to was another place this shows up is in the area of negotiation. There are many points where you have to negotiate something in your career. The terms of a job, how much space you're going to have. Again, who gets to go to give the big keynote talk at the conference and so on. All the time there are negotiations. And social science research, and I've got one of the books there by Babcock and Lashover from Carnegie Mellon, shows that it turns out that in US culture, women tend not to be very comfortable with negotiation, tend not to necessarily recognize when there's the opportunity to negotiate to begin with, and are generally worried about, oh, if I push too hard in the negotiation, I will break the relationship, I will be too aggressive, I will then have trouble actually working with the person afterwards. And as a result, for asking for less, tend to get less out of the negotiation. At the same time, when women are negotiating, they do tend to use, they're more likely to use what's called interest-based as opposed to position-based negotiation. So position-based is, I must have this thing. And I'm going to sit here and argue until you give me this thing, and we are adversarial. And interest-based says, here's a general goal I'd like to achieve. I think we're both interested in this goal. How can we get to this goal together? That's the interest. The latter is much more effective generally because there are usually many ways that you could get to the goal. And maybe I don't know that you have certain constraints where you could offer me maybe more space, less money, and it would come out to the same thing. And if I had a preconception that I needed less space, more money, we could have a big fight about something you couldn't even control, and it would be sort of useless. So it turns out, so this interest-based negotiation, turns out women actually, as socialized in our culture, are more likely to use that. So if we will be willing to engage, we can actually do it pretty well. But we're usually not even willing to. This is something, though, that's learnable. And there are many different ways. Again, there are different solutions to how to get people to be more willing to engage in negotiation. But it's also, negotiation, I think, is interesting because it's a place where implicit bias does come in again. Both the women's implicit bias about how aggressive is it appropriate for me to be in a negotiation, and the person on the other side of the table is thinking the same thing, regardless if they're a man or a woman. I can remember a situation where a woman faculty member, when I was a dean, came to see me and said, I'm in a fixed-term position. I think, based on my record, you should put me into a tenure-track position. And I found myself feeling all ruffled by that. And then I thought, her CV is really excellent, and I know how good she is at everything. Why am I feeling so bothered about that? And then I suddenly realized a man had come to me a couple years earlier with the same sort of proposition, and I hadn't felt all bothered about it. I'd looked at it and evaluated it, and indeed, he moved into a tenure-track position. And I suddenly realized I was getting emotionally all strung up because this was a woman. And even more, it happened to be an Asian American woman. So there was even another layer of stereotype about how assertive one should be. And as soon as I recognized that, I said, whoa, okay, set the stereotype, look at the CV, and she got into the tenure-track position because she fully deserved it. And I think she may be now a full professor by now. So implicit bias ties right into this. And this impacts, whatever your starting salary you negotiate or how much space you start with, does have a big impact on the future career, how high your salary will ever get, how productive you're able to be. So there are tangible impacts. Again, there are solutions, some of which are, most of that's still on the page. Again, you can look at that, or we can talk about that later. But I wanted to spend some time then talking about what happens at the level of leadership. Because leadership, they're very hierarchical organizations, like the police or the military, where everybody wears their rank. They have a rank. They wear it literally on them. Yeah, this isn't rank. This is just a picture of a piece of art on our campus. And so everybody knows who has authority over whom and how deferential you have to be. And if somebody at a higher rank gives an order, the other person knows they have to follow the order. I can assure you, as a provost, no, not that way. If I tried to ever give an order to a faculty member, they would laugh hysterically. Really? would not make any sense. And in a more research-focused organization like this as well, it isn't a matter of people giving orders and having very, very strict hierarchy. Instead, there's a matter of trying to figure out how do you persuade people to follow a direction that you think is good for the organization. My advantage is I can see over the whole organization. I could figure out maybe where we ought to be going, but then the question is how to get there together. And the different people that I'm working with, of course, are kind of like these people in this is a rope-based climbing structure in Norway, actually. And you can see that these three people, from looking at them, it's not necessarily clear which way is up gravitationally or down. They're all oriented kind of differently. They're different vertical levels and so on. And sometimes leadership in an academic or research context feels a bit like that. And so let's talk about that a little bit and how that impacts women's experience of being leaders. Okay, yep, most of that is on the slide. Okay, that's good. So as we've been talking about, women at the senior level are relatively rare in many areas of STEM and in physics in particular. Well, if you haven't already climbed the ladder of the academic or research career, you're not going to be considered for a leadership role in the first place. So that narrows down the pool. Secondly, along the way, the women tend to have less access to resources that would help people progress faster in their careers. And at some point, I mean, a career is only so long. And if it's taking you longer to get to the level of senior scientist or full professor or what have you, that means you have fewer years at the senior level when you could even be preparing for or considered for a top leadership role. So again, further narrowing down the scope. Then there are things about, just like women actors, there's a distinct point where they're deemed to be too old for most roles. Same thing is true in leadership. There's a distinct point when women go from being, you're too young, to, you're too old. There's a much wider range deemed acceptable for men, interestingly enough, at least in leadership in American sort of academic and research contexts. And then networks come into play, because there's research showing that the networks that women form and that men form tend to be different. Women tend to have much smaller networks, be less connected in the organization. But that means that if a woman is going to be an internal candidate, then it's probably less likely that there would be that groundswell of support that you might need for an internal candidate to be seen as a viable candidate. So again, narrowing the pool, narrowing the likelihood. Now those are things for who might even be a candidate in the first place. Then there are other constraints based on one's own personal experience. So if you're a pioneer, if you're an only, if you're one of just the one or two or three in the whole unit, you may be so busy dealing with not only your work, doing your research, but being the pioneer, that you may not have the mental space to think, what do I want to be doing in 10 years? Do I want to be some sort of a leader in the organization? You may not even have the time. You may also be more prone, women are more prone to have that imposter syndrome, where you're convinced that despite all the stuff on your CV, that you're really a fraud, you don't really belong there, and they are going to notice. And they are going to unmask you as a fraud, and it's going to be terrible. It's like one of those bad dreams where you dream that you show up to the exam and you find you never took the course, but you have to take the exam. I never know why, but you do have to take the exam. So it's sort of like that, feeling like that. So you may be less likely in the face of both of these to put yourself forward as a candidate for leadership. But then consider who else might put you forward. Well, people who would tend to put you forward might be people who are already leaders, looking for who's the next generation to bring forward. Well, humans tend to be a little xenophobic. We tend to be most comfortable with people that we think are like us. And we're more likely to mentor people that we think are like us. Now, they might be like us in that they're really, really into deep inelastic scattering, and that's all they want to talk about. So I'm really comfortable talking with them. Or sometimes it is based on race, on gender, on factors like that. And because most of the people in leadership in STEM right now are white men, any tendency towards mentoring people who are most similar to you, any even small tendency towards that, can mean that other white men are most likely to get the mentoring who are, that would lead them to have a leadership opportunity. Now, you might think, well, why isn't that changing? Partly because whenever something becomes the status quo, becomes how things are, we don't always question, why is this how things are? We might just unconsciously assume, well, it's this way for some good reason, even if I can't think of what that reason is. We don't always unpack it and think, oh, well, if I go back in history, there are all these things that happened to occur in history that lead us to this point. We just think, no, this is just how things are, and it's probably good. And especially if we're the person in power, we probably think, oh, you know, life's good, I'm comfortable, I'm happy, I'm doing my thing. And unless I make myself stop and think about, wait, should I be here? Should I be doing something to make sure that, say, more people of color also get an opportunity to be in leadership? I might just go on mentoring white people and not even ever think about it. So the third thing that gets in the way of a senior person, maybe from recognizing a woman's potential, has to do with how we think about people moving into leadership in terms of the nature of the job. Now, usually the first time you become like an associate director of a lab, just to pick something, you probably weren't one before, right? You probably weren't exactly that thing before. You probably had some other role, maybe a division director or something like that. And so when people are considering whom to appoint to a new role, they look at the sum total of everything the person did in their old roles, and they're thinking, does that add up to enough skills, enough experience, enough relevant accomplishment that I could see them moving up to the next thing? And it turns out that people, again, from social science research, and this is something also that Babcock and Lashiver now have written about, we're more likely culturally to believe that a man can make a bigger leap and that a woman has to make a lateral. And so, for example, my being selected to be the executive vice chancellor at UC San Diego is a little unusual because I'd been a dean, but I hadn't been a dean of a mega college with 10,000 students. I hadn't been doing something really, really similar to being a provost. I'd had several different roles. I was an associate provost. I was the dean of 2 different colleges, sometimes at the same time, and so on. And if you add all that up, you might conclude, okay, she can make the leap. But many people wouldn't, particularly because of my being a woman. And so all of these things can make it harder for women to get in. And if you look then, if you think, just look at the nature of the college presidency, and this is data from the American Council on Education. The circle is indicating graphically what job did people who are now college presidents have before they became college presidents. And you can see that the dark gray hatched area here that's people who already were either a college president or an interim president. And about 70% of people who are college presidents are men. So, okay, so that's a big chunk of the circle, and it's mostly guys who are in that chunk of the circle. Now, the next big chunk of the circle here, this arc, is people who are a provost. About 75% of the provosts at research universities are men, and that fraction is actually growing at the moment. So you have this huge part of the circle where where it's seen not as a big leap to get there, as the most lateral, so in a sense the half of the circle from which it would be easiest for a woman to make the transition to president, but women are not incredibly likely to be in that half of the circle. The other part of the circle is other roles like chief diversity officer, dean, head of fundraising, student affairs, these sorts of things, where there are a lot more women in that arc of the circle, but getting from there to president is seen as a bigger leap. So there are more women there, but then they're a little less attractive candidates because of the bigger leap involved. So you can see how these factors tend to impact who is then, and of course, there are a lot more deans out there than there are provosts, because every university has many deans and one provost. So you can see how this is impacting the likelihood that women are going to rise to be president. So let's think now about what do you do once you are a leader? How do you lead in an academic setting when there isn't, you can't give orders and there aren't very, very clear ranks and lines of authority? And so you have to keep in mind as a leader in a research or academic context that authority is indirect. You're going to persuade people that your ideas are interesting, get them to buy in, and get them to come along with you and co-create things. You're going to operate in a context of shared governance where there are committees, standing committees of different kinds, users committees, and so on, that you have to work with because they have a lot of knowledge. They may have a lot of authority for getting people to agree that, yeah, this is a good step to take. So there are all these constraints on how you're going to get things done. There are particular powers that you have, however, to bring to bear. One is moral authority. You can articulate the values that the university or the lab should be using as the bedrock for all of its decisions. Things like inclusion, things like intellectual curiosity, whatever they may be appropriate to the organization, you can articulate that and get that hook into people's sense of what is right and that sense of emotion. And that can be very powerful for bringing people together. You can work on listening to others. That's a surprising power. When people believe that you will listen, that you care what they think, suddenly they're much more interested in what you think. So that's, in a sense, a power. But it's, again, it's almost an inverted power. The third, convening. As the provost, if I ask people to come meet with me, they will. I can, even though I can't subpoena them or anything like that, they believe that if I want to talk to them, they really do need to come see me. And so I can gather together task forces and I can get people to come talk with me. And that's a power, to start conversations that can take you a long way. Now these powers exist for leaders regardless of their gender, regardless of their race, and so on. But what happens, oh wow, okay. Yeah, all right, you'll have to read through at least everything squeezed on there. What happens when you encounter, and I'll talk about this through the lens of gender, what are the gender dimensions then of the experience of being a leader? So when my chancellor was interviewing me for the role of EVC, he asked if I was ready to live in a fishbowl. He said, when you walk around campus, people will know who you are, and they'll be watching to see what you do. And they'll be listening to see what you say, and they'll be listening to what you don't say and drawing volumes of conclusions. Oh, she didn't mention my unit. Oh my God, she's going to disband my center. You know, people draw amazing conclusions. I'm not exaggerating. The emails that I get with people worried about, wait, you phrased it with this particular word. Does this mean? And then a paragraph of inference. So he asked if I was ready for that. And I didn't realize at the time that the scrutiny was going to be even more severe because I'm a woman because people would have assumptions about how I ought to act as a woman. So this started showing up for me. You remember the story about like the airplane, the people saying, you don't look like a physicist. So nowadays when I go to events, usually they're fundraising events of some kind. And I'm there, and I'm talking to people that have never met me before, and we're all milling around at some sort of reception and having snacks, and you run into somebody, and you ask each other, oh, how are you connected to the university? And at least once a month, and sometimes 3 times a week, a person, and every single time this has been a senior white man, every single time, so cultural factors coming in, right? Has said to me, let's see, and hearing that my role is I'm the chief academic officer of the institution, I've had, I'm skeptical. Thinking, what? You're skeptical, okay. I've gotten, what qualifies you for that role? I'm like, my 3 degrees from Harvard, my 15 years experience as a dean, being a distinguished professor, you pick. I've gotten, you're too young for that role. I'm thinking, you have no idea how old I am. Why are you saying this? I've gotten, how did you get chosen for that role? I'm like, I applied. I went through 3 strange stages of grueling interviews. Why did the chancellor pick you for that role? And I'm always tempted to say, he's standing 2 yards away. You want me to bring him over and you can ask him? Sometimes they ask my husband the question, how did your wife ever get picked for that job? And of course, I'm never there when he's asked that, so I don't know precisely what he says to them. But sometimes people will take a different tactic and they'll make, because my title is Executive Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs, sometimes they'll make what they think is a really clever, risque joke based on some of the words in my title. And those ones I've just started giving the death stare to until they get a little embarrassed and they change the subject. And then I follow them to the new subject and we have a lovely conversation about the recent observation of a black hole at the center of a galaxy, and we go talk about something really safe like that. But I hadn't expected that people were going to be so open about their prejudice, and they don't realize what they're saying. They're not really thinking about it, and they're clearly not thinking about not only how they're insulting me, but how, and most of these events are at the chancellor's official residence, they're not really thinking about how deeply they're insulting the chancellor whose house they're at by implying he, didn't hire competent people? I mean, so all very interesting. So that's one thing that you encounter, and you have to be able to laugh it off, because otherwise you'll never get the job done. You find that as a leader, you're supposed to display vision, you're supposed to be decisive enough that you do make decisions so that the work can go on, you're supposed to be able to focus. But those are not how women are expected to behave in our society. And so it can be kind of a challenge. People are uncomfortable then when women act that way. Of course, they're uncomfortable when anyone acts that way because it means this leader is going to change things and I might not like the change. So there's always that, but doing it as a woman, there's kind of an extra layer. And so I find that I actually have to consciously think about how am I going to head off the challenges to my role, challenges to the basic authority that I do have. And I've come up with a few different things. One is I have to know the rules really well. I have to be able to tell you off the top of my head that APM 015 is the University of California Code of Faculty Conduct. I have to be able to tell you that APM 016 specifies the discipline that is prescribed for people who violate the Code of Faculty Conduct. I have to be able to tell you APM 075 deals with termination for cause, and on and on. APM Academic Personnel Manual. So you have to learn all the acronyms, you have to learn the rules. You have to know that because even though in philosophy, argument from authority is a fallacy, in academic leadership, being able to cite the rule as That's so. It's not just because I say so. You'd think if I was the provost, maybe sometimes that would be. No, the rules say so, and I know what the rules are, and we can go read them together. So you have to know that backwards and forwards. You have to know which roles carry which authority, to which role has the chancellor, who is in charge of everything for the campus, delegated particular functions. You have to know that cold. At the same time, that means that once you know about these roles, you realize who you have to build relationships with. So if someone's going to be challenging me on something, I have to have built up a good working relationship with campus council, or with the head of human resources, or the head of equity and diversity, so that I can just call them right then and there and say, just double checking with you, blah, blah, blah. And they'll say, oh yes, I can put them on speakerphone. We get the matter sorted out. You have to have those close professional relationships, again, to extend authority, and to make sure that you can call on them in emergency, and that they'll know that they can call on me in an emergency, and that I'll make some sensible decision as well. Like if you need emergency access to someone's email because someone's accused of doing something really bad with it, in their job, the campus council has to have confidence that when he calls me and says, we need emergency access to this person's email because we're investigating something critical that might impact the university, he has to have confidence that I'll make a reasoned decision and that I'll remember to consult the privacy officer first to make sure we're doing it in the right way that protects people's legitimate privacy rights. Reputation is a big one. I find that, so if I simply tell people what my decision is, somebody may not like my decision. I have to say no a lot, right? There's a finite amount of money. There's a finite amount of space. And it's really important that I explain the basis for every decision. Here are the principles I used in thinking about what to do. Here's the history of how it's been done before. Here's exactly how I arrived at my decision. And it's not just impacting you, it's impacting these other people as well. And I have to be really, really careful to spell that out, because if I don't, I get very aggressive pushback, and I get accused of doing things randomly and so on. And going along with that, I have to do all this. You've probably heard about Fred Astaire, Gene Kelly, these wonderful, wonderful dancers in the old movies from the 1940s, right? And people praise them to the skies, and they forget that, as the saying goes, Ginger Rogers did all that dancing, but backwards and in high heels, right? So it's not that men leaders don't have to negotiate these things, but I have to do these things at the same time presenting a persona that people find relatable enough that they won't simply turn me off, tune me out. I'm supposed to be, as a woman, caring and warm and kind and very concerned for everybody, even while I'm telling you, I cannot double the size of your building. But I'm supposed to do it in a caring, pink, sparkly way. And you should see, I've had situations where people were questioning the email I wrote, and I'm looking at it, and I'm like, this email is 5 times as long as it had to be to convey the fact, because I made it so pink and sparkly, And someone who hadn't seen the email accused me of having written a rude email, and I had to show them and say, where's the rude? And I don't think my male colleagues are getting quite that. But relatability comes out, so particularly if I have to tell somebody no, or if somebody is not happy with something I've done and they want to meet with me, I have to really be willing to go the extra mile to meet with them, to meet with whomever. Because if I don't meet with them, they're going to take it in one of 2 ways. One is that I'm too insecure to meet with them, because that goes along with gender stereotypes. Women are timid and retiring and so on. So people would be comfortable with that assumption because it goes along with gender norms. But it's a bad quality for a leader. I can't have people thinking I'm insecure, because that would not work. The opposite thing that they might assume is that I'm too officious. I'm too proud to be willing to meet with them. So that's obviously a bad way for a leader to work, but it also goes against gender norms. So that would be even worse for them to be thinking that about me. So I really have to keep that fine line of relatability. as a woman. And it's something, it's interesting the amount of mental energy one has to expend on this. So how do we get past this? Part of it is doing what we're doing today, talking about these things, talking about this among yourselves. Because if we speak out openly, we can lessen the impact. We can start using our conscious minds instead of our implicit biases in making decisions. We can restructure some of the basic processes and mechanisms that we use to do things so that they're more overtly fair to everybody. Often when you do that, it turns out that if you're restructuring in a way that is less sexist, it turns out it actually benefits everybody because sometimes when a structure is not very family friendly, for example, it may disproportionately impact women because of the larger caregiving role women are expected to take on in our society. But there are plenty of guys who have caregiving roles for their children or their parents, and so it's actually better for them too. Talking about wellness, talking about making sure that people are comfortable taking sick days if they need them, or if they're going through a rough patch, they're able to discuss this, that this is a normal part of life that we could mention in the workplace. That can have an impact on how everybody approaches work and approaches leadership. And we can all try to do a better job of identifying a more diverse group of potential future leaders, because that's the way we change, who's seen as able to be part of leadership. I've done just briefly a couple things along those lines. I run a career development workshop for women from developing nations, women physicists. I run it with a colleague from graduate school who's now back at a faculty job in India. And so we bring together about 60 or 80 women from Latin America and from Africa and different parts of Asia and the Middle East every couple years. I've been part of LGBT plus physicists, which is a grassroots advocacy organization working to make things better in physics. So there are a lot of different things that you can do to help work on these problems. And so I would just ask that going forward, speak about these things, stand up for those who are trying to make a difference, support them. Maybe you don't feel comfortable making the big push yourself, but when somebody is not sure if, is that advocacy work a good thing for us to do in a science context, you could be the one who says, yes, and I'm proud that my colleague is doing this. Let's help them. That can make a big difference. Listen to what people are experiencing, and we are working now to establish an APS forum on diversity and inclusion. There's a petition that's going to come around, I think late this summer, asking people to help that get established. So think about that, and maybe even help us get established. The last couple slides that you'll be able to access, they're books, they're articles, they're organizations, just places to get more information. So thanks for listening, and I hope we can have a conversation.
As I said, we're going to try and use microphones. As chair of the colloquium committee, you can carry one. And I'll give it to Whitney, Adam, unless you want to volunteer. You're on the colloquium committee, so you can carry one as well.
Thank you. It was a really great talk. A lot of data, a lot of resources for us to go back to. I have a question. You said when you were, receiving those comments, like insults, you thought that the best way to go about them is just laugh it off and continue the discussion instead of stopping the person and say, I'm sorry, this is, disrespectful, and unless you think about it, I'm not carrying on the conversation. That would be my approach. Because they will not do the same to us. If we say anything, even normal thing, as you said, why should we go about caring in our emails? Why shouldn't we just do our business?
So, great question. So when people have made the off-color jokes, I do stop them. And I stop them in their tracks and say, that's a terrible thing to say. And I won't necessarily keep talking to them. the ones who are questioning my qualifications, I pretty much shove my qualifications in their face, and then I take the conversation somewhere else, because as an officer of the university, it's actually part of my job to interact with them and to make them want to work with the university. And so I've got to be very careful about that, because I could damage the institution if I am not willing to say, okay, let me point out where you're wrong. Now let's forgive that and move on, and let's go somewhere else and interact differently. So I do have an obligation to find a way to work with them. The pink sparkly emails, it saves me time and hassle. If I wrote curt emails, I could do it, and I could just say, hey folks, live with it. The guys write these same emails. But then I'd spend all my time saying that. And so it's just a choice I made. There's no one right way to do it. And different people handle this differently. And there are many different ways to handle it. I make one particular choice. And it varies a little bit too. Of course, if somebody is in my office talking to me and they're talking over me and they're interrupting, I will stop them. I will say, no, you will let me speak. You will let me finish. I encounter that a lot when I have to deal with the outcomes of the things like sexual harassment cases. And when somebody and their attorney come to see me, particularly some of the attorneys will try to talk over me, and I'll have to really take a very hard line on that. But I do also believe that we all make mistakes, we can all learn, we can all forgive each other a little. So I can point it out and then say, okay, let's move on together. Other questions?
First of all, thank you very much. We really appreciate the opportunity to talk about some of these things with this group of people particularly. Amongst the many things that resonated with me, one thing that you shared, pioneers often lack the time to reflect, I think is oftentimes lost on some of the people who aren't necessarily dealing with that issue about mental energy on a daily basis. And then beyond that, you mentioned also the value in discussing these concerns and mentoring and advocating for people in scientific settings, not exclusively in diversity and inclusion conversations. And I want to just ask you just to expand upon that, because I think it's a point that we can't understate, particularly, again, for those folks of us who are spending mental energy on a daily basis in that case.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think that one of the things that we have to keep in mind is that when the statistics of who participates in our science are so skewed that there are too few, just comparing with the population at large, women are missing, African Americans are missing, Hispanic Americans are missing. It means that we're missing talented people who would have had interesting ideas, who might have just brought that next breakthrough that much quicker. Our science is losing by not having those talented people in the room, and by not having them there because of reasons that have nothing to do with their science and their talent. So we should discuss it in scientific settings, because this is impacting science to the detriment of science. And that's what we sometimes forget. It's not just an HR issue. We want the best and the brightest by everything that they're going to bring to the table to be here, and we're keeping some at arm's length.
More questions? Was there a question here?
So you gave that example with the negotiations when that Asian American woman came to you and asked for a tenure track. So unfortunately, there are not many people who are like you and who can say, "Oh, stop! That is my personal bias. I have to think again." So in order to be successful, women also often have to negotiate in a different way. And so they have to negotiate more like what you mentioned, interest-based, and less like, oh, I want that promotion because I deserve it. Mm-hmm. So like if women go that way, they won't reach their goal. Can you comment on that or give advice?
Yeah, that's actually a great question. I think, so one thing that that there are a number of books on negotiation out there, by the way. There's probably the first one in this vein was Getting to Yes, for example, and many of the things that, that are talked about in Women Don't Ask, which is the Babcock and Lashover book, are sort of in that same vein. And one of the things that they talk about is techniques for if the person on the other side of the table is being very position-based instead of interest-based, how do you try to work them around to it? How do you, and they talk about saying, well, let's take a step back and talk about a bigger picture for a minute to try to expand what you're talking about till it's something that you know the other person cares about or you can see, and then you kind of reel it back in to where you're trying to go. So I would definitely recommend reading those books for the details on how exactly you do that, sort of broadening the picture to scoop the other person in. The other thing I can say is the first time that I was the dean hiring people, I'd never hired someone in my life. I had not been a department chair. So I'm sitting across the table from, we hired 3 or 4 different people that year. I'm sitting across the table from them and I'm realizing I have no idea how to do this. We muddled through together, I hired them, it was all good. 3 years later, hiring, further crop, and I suddenly realized, wait, I know how to do this because I've already hired a couple dozen people by now. You on the other side of the table, this is your first job. You still don't know anything. And this is bad for me because this isn't really an adversarial situation. We both want you to get the whatever startup you need so that you will succeed because I'm hiring you because I want you to succeed. But if you won't tell me what you need, or if you don't know how to tell me, or if you don't know that you can tell me, you won't tell me, and then I'll give you the wrong stuff, and then you'll struggle. And so I started giving them a tip sheet. Before we would negotiate, I would email them a tip sheet explaining it's not adversarial, tell me what you need, put it all out there, don't tell me sequentially and in little dribbles over many weeks, because it'll be a problem. And they would read that, and it got better. And eventually I wrote it up as an article in Inside Higher Ed, and then they would start reading the article, and then they would come in to negotiate. And it was much better because we got them where they needed to be. So I would say people coming into a negotiation for the first time, they should read up on some of how you do it. And there are many books out there, because it lets you look at the chessboard from above and see, okay, oh, here's where we are. Okay, and we need to be here. Let me try to edge us over towards here so you're not as much a prisoner of circumstance, even if the other person isn't realizing that they should be trying to help.
So just a comment, APS, American Physical Society, because we have our own APS here, the Advanced Photon Source.
Oh, yes, right.
Whenever I say APS, they get confused.
Of course.
So the American Physical Society did the training, I think 5 years ago, to several of us, trained the trainer in negotiation. And I've been given 2 hours or 3 hours workshops all across. It's a really good material. Maybe if there is a need here, we can do one session. It's really very important to go through that training, a lot to learn.
Yeah, they've trained hundreds of people by now, the American Physical Society. That's been really helpful. Mm-hmm.
A different question. So this talk is focused mostly on gender, and rightly so. I think that's what we all came for, but also touched some on race. So I guess the meta question I had based on that is, how do we determine which categories of, say, minority persons are important for considering in hiring? I mean, we could consider various nationalities. Obviously, gender is important. You could consider religious or cultural minorities, political minorities. How do we determine what is truly important in order to foster a productive diversity? What are the steps we would do to make that identification? Well,
there are certainly many dimensions that one could consider. I would say that we have. I would say that the data is strongest that the economic impact on women and on African Americans, Hispanic Americans, Native Americans, the impact of discrimination and bias in hiring and jobs and wealth generation is really, really, really strong. And so I think that that's a place that we as a nation and that we as a national lab here, a public university where I work, should really be focusing on. Women still earn a fraction on the dollar. African American households have maybe 10% of the assets of white families on average. And so these are places where the cultural and hiring practices of our public institutions have clearly had tremendous detrimental impact. I would say also, you can say women are half the population and we're 10% of the full professors. There's clearly a big talent gap, a lot of people who are being excluded. African Americans are, 13% of the population. I'm not sure if I'm getting the number exactly right, but a tiny fraction of those in physics. That's just so screamingly obvious that it's a problem. And so I think we need to, that's why the federal government did come up with equal opportunity and affirmative action as saying these are such obvious cases that we really have to attend to them. Now we have to be careful that we're not discriminating against people on the basis of religion, on the basis of political views, on the basis of veteran status, many, many other things. Absolutely on the basis of nationality, whether somebody has an accent, all sorts of things we should not be. But I think that the cases of race and gender are cases to start with because they've been so bad for so long. The economic data is so clear. And we do have the federal government on our side saying, hey, we have the National Science Foundation and the NIH regulations on our side pointing out what we ought to be doing. I want to be careful not to go into politics. This is not intended to be a political talk.
Hi. I just actually want, getting back to the question that Frederica brought up and the comments about the training on negotiation, that I think it links to this idea of reducing situational ambiguity of negotiations, right? The more that we know about the context that we're in and the less ambiguous it is about how you are expected to behave, the more successful women negotiators tend to be. So I think that it is true, and there is a lot of data that women don't negotiate as often as men, but I think that they have to be more experienced negotiators, and that there are things that we as organizations can do to reduce the situational ambiguity of these situations, and just as you've described, to help make things more of an equal playing field.
Absolutely, yeah, that makes a tremendous difference. And it also, I mean, again, there are many cases where using gender or using race as the lens through which we're initially trying to address some of these issues ends up having positive benefits for others. For example, women acculturated in the US, again, as we were talking about, less predisposed to negotiate. But I bet that there are people of all genders from different parts of the world where negotiation is handled differently. And if those folks are working here, they may be approaching negotiation maybe with some trepidation also. So the steps that are being taken based on our concerns for, wait a second, we can see this has a gender impact, will help a much broader group of people as well.
More questions? Whitney?
How do you get past the whole, you are here because you are checking boxes? Oh, you are Asian American, LGBT, single family, blah, 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 blah. You're here to check these boxes. Because I've been in a lot of classes where I have seen a lot of diversity, but either people that were in those classes didn't give a shit. They were there because they had scholarship. They were first generation trying to get to school. And this is how they got their money, is because they could check those boxes. And I've also been in classes where there was absolutely no diversity except for me, but the people there absolutely loved what they were doing and were there because this is what they absolutely wanted to do. So how do you get past the, I am trying to check boxes because diversity?
Absolutely. Checking boxes is not the point. You have to start from a bedrock belief that that talent is distributed across all human beings equally. Access is a societal, a culturally determined thing that is not. And what I'm trying to do is erase the access barriers so that any human being with the talent and the interest can go into whatever field they want to be in. And you have to start by stating moral principles like that, because otherwise you fall into the checkbox mentality, which does nobody any good. It poisons the atmosphere for everybody. So it's only if we focus on the importance of having all the right talent in the room, whatever human package that talent comes in. If we remember that research has shown that social scientists look at all these great questions. If you have teams that bring people who solve problems in different ways, who come from different backgrounds and bring different kinds of training, that team is less likely to get stuck at a difficult point in whatever it's trying to do than a team where everyone has the same training or everybody has the same background, no matter what the team looks like, but what they have, where they've been, what their educational and cultural and intellectual history is makes a difference, because homogeneous teams, they'll get stuck because everybody confronts this particular problem and nobody has a different idea about how to go about it, whereas the more diverse team, somebody or maybe a couple people will put together something that will carry them further. So it's because of things like that that convince me that we will progress further by harnessing all the talent. That's why I'm there. That's why we have to do this, not for tick box. Because you're right, I've been at job interviews where I could figure out that, oh, they wanted to have a woman on the short list to tick a box. And then it's a hideous experience for everybody. Me, them, waste of time. So, but it's complicated. The human dimension is what makes this really hard.
Thank you so much for your speech. It was really wonderful and very enlightening. I just was wondering throughout your career if you have any tips on safety. At Argonne, we talk a lot about our core values and mainly about physical safety, but just culturally, people feeling safe, the LGBT community, minorities, everyone, men, women, non-binary.
Yeah.
I think that's something that Argonne really needs to address and work towards, and just anything sort of trainings. And I know on the day-to-day we can all work on making people feel more safe in the way we interact with our colleagues and interact with each other. So if there's anything that just stuck out to you that you've noticed in your career that was effective in promoting that.
Yeah, that's a really great question. And sometimes, one thing that I've found that it's important to point out is we can't set expectations for one another as to how we're going to react. You must react in this way if you receive an insult or somebody seems to not be welcoming, because you have to determine, am I safe enough, like given the stage of my career, given who else is in the room, given the long-term impact, do I feel safe and comfortable to point out to them, hey, that kind of came across as insulting. Is that how you really meant it? Or would even a very soft approach like that not work? Because we do have to keep ourselves safe so that we can go on doing our science and do what we came here to do. What I have seen to be good to help people who want to learn how to be better colleagues to one another, which is, I think, what it's about for all of us. And I include myself. I mean, all of us need to learn more about how to be more kind, more collegial towards each other. There are live theater-based trainings where, I don't know if you've seen those, where a group of actors acts out a little scene. It could be a committee doing its work. It could be a mentoring encounter, job interview. And the different actors play their roles and they display, different ways we humans might do a better or a worse job in a particular situation, but then they freeze and they stay in role, and you can ask them, character one, what were you thinking when you said that? And then they can tell you, oh, I was thinking such and such. And you realize they had this very narrow lens on it, and they had no clue that to somebody from a different perspective, they were saying something vastly insulting. And you can realize, and then you can have a conversation with the characters about, okay, so how could you move from here to there? And it can spark great discussion where nobody is accusing anybody. Because after all, most of it isn't about intention. It's about how it comes across to the other person. Most of us don't come to work every day saying, oh, how can I insult everybody else? Right? I mean, at least not in our jobs. We want to be good colleagues. Sometimes we don't know how to be, or sometimes we sort of forget or we make a mistake. So the kinds of discussions that those trainings can spark can help us also be more willing to change, more willing to forgive ourselves, more willing to forgive the other person, because every one of us will say that stupid thing sometimes. So I found that can really help. But it's the continuing to talk about it so it feels like a normal thing to talk about and we can relax a little. Especially, we've talked about gender today. Gender is a little hard to talk about in America. Race is so hard to talk about in America. I mean, we do a bad job of it. And part of it is, at least for white people of my generation, I was brought up, and my parents are extremely liberal, and they're academics and everything, but I was somehow brought up with the idea that you shouldn't mention race. And I would never even describe myself as white, which is stupid. I mean, I am very white. And it's not like that's a secret, but it was like that was not polite to talk about. And so when I came into a leadership role, and I had to be talking with the head of the equity and diversity officer at my institution, I suddenly realized that was really, really stymieing me, not able to talk honestly about race and where there were things I didn't understand and where there were things that I felt awkward talking about. Same when I first started working with the LGBT community and realizing sometimes when I was giving a talk in a physics audience, that might have been the first time anybody on that stage had ever said the word lesbian aloud. And the ceiling didn't fall in. It was okay. So talking about it together, but finding ways to do it where everyone in the room wants to engage in the conversation can help, I've found.
Thank you.
More questions? Now's a good time. Okay, so before we thank Elizabeth, I just want to say that at 3:30 today, we'll put on another coffee just out where we had, and people from PHY and a few people from HEP will be meeting with Elizabeth to continue these discussions. If anyone in this room would like to join us, you're more than welcome. It'll be about 3:30 for about half an hour. So yes, thank Elizabeth for a fantastic final colloquium.